Thank you, all three of you. Congratulations on the film. Thank you for being here. Thank everybody
Thank
else.
you for watching it. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So, Margot, I think she's one of the most portrayed women in all of film. We can think of it's almost intimidating to name the list. Betty Davis.
It's not almost intimidating. It's very intimidating. Yeah.
But Betty Davis, Cate Blanchett, Glenda Jackson, Judi Dench, Helen
Catherine
Mirren.
Hepburn.
Hepburn. What is your first memory of becoming aware of her? Was it through a film interpretation, or was it just from history books?
Probably from films. Yeah, most things I know. Actually, I'd say almost everything I know is from movies. That was very much my education. So yeah, probably everyone's portrayal of her. Though I've never actually watched the movies about Elizabeth, thank God, because and I avoided it, and I still haven't watched it. Not until I finally get to see the movie. I haven't seen the final cut of the movie. Not until I see it am I going to go back and watch everyone else's portrayal of her.
And once you agreed to take the part, was that even more of a conscious decision not to mimic or subconsciously take too much in?
Yeah, definitely. No, I wanted to avoid watching anyone else's iterations of her. Yeah.
So what was your source of research? I mean, it's based on a book by John Guy, which is extensive.
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot because I had a lot to learn about the Renaissance period and just everything that was happening at the time. I knew very little. I was more interested in history from further before that, but never really that time period. I didn't actually think I was going to find it that interesting, and it's actually fascinating. So, and I got to spend a lot of time with John, which was wicked. We got to go to Hampton Court Palace and stuff, and he would tell me endless stories, very personal, more personal stories, I guess, than what you'd learn in a history book. And that's what I found interesting. It's the little details, the little moments that made her become a real person in my mind. And Josie was great. I explained to Josie that, like I said just before, everything I know is from movies. So instead of doing like a historical timeline, she did like a movie historical timeline for me. And she was like, that movie, that's when that happened. And then you watch this movie, that's 50 years later. And then So Josie, our director, has an amazing way of making everything very relatable.
In her first feature film, I mean, she's done so much for theater. In fact, I think Jack is right now working with her, doing Measure for Measure in London.
Yeah, literally finished Saturday night. Yeah, and then came here.
Curious to ask you two guys about kind of a similar question to what I asked Margot about the sort of omnipresence of Elizabeth in our culture. And Jack, I think I've heard you say you think one of the great performances is Cate Blanchett's in Elizabeth. How much has this story, her story, resonated with you just from as a cultural story to tell?
Well, I mean, I'm Scottish. I grew up in Scotland, and you can't. The thing about the two countries is that they are brothers, they are sisters, and for most of history, one has been a bigger brother or bigger sister to the other, and has been a bully at times. And has been a friend at times, obviously. So growing up where I grew up, and probably where Joe grew up, you can't help but be aware of Elizabeth. She's probably considered their greatest ever monarch, and at a time where England just raced ahead and was all of a sudden became the superpower up against Spain and France. That was its golden age, literally. So you can't help but be aware of it when you grow up. Where we grew up, and Mary, contradictorily, Mary is really pumped at you as a romantic figure, a tragic figure. A lot of Scottish figures from history are they're very, very romantic, but always / tragic. And a lot of that is to do with our big sister nation next door to us. So yeah, it's I'm very, very honoured to be part of something that really explores it. And in terms of other people playing her before, particularly Elizabeth, is that what I always find remarkable whenever someone plays them, and it's exactly what Margot's done, is there's sometimes a tendency when you play a queen or you play a king that you have to play somebody that is all powerful in every aspect, even in like little personal scenes. And what I find remarkable about what Margot's done is that she was never afraid to show like a vulnerability and something, and making mistakes and not knowing what to do, which I think is always the biggest mistake when people play kings or queens. And I think that's what's remarkable about what both Saoirse and Margot have done in the film.
Joe, your character you play has also been portrayed with various degrees of generosity and malice throughout many different portrayals. What was your? I mean, this is like sort of a kindler, gentler. I mean, you're, no pun intended. I guess you're her favorite, considering that you have experience with that.
There we go. Yeah, he very much is in this. I think he's the one male character who is a bit of an outsider in that sense, where the other men in the film act more based on their own agendas of politics and power and hierarchy. He acts out of love and loyalty for Elizabeth. And I think that doesn't mean he's incapable of going the other way, but in this version, that's what we see. And which is interesting because, I mean, he was married in real life, and some people think, he even murdered his wife in real life. But through conversations with Josie and the script that Bo came up with, it was clear that it was a kinder version in this one anyway. Yeah.
Because you went on a run appearing this fall in 4 movies, in Operation Finale and Boy Erased and The Favorite. Where did this production land in that whole schedule?
This was second, right after The Favorite. Yeah, so it was 2 very, very different period films and experiences. I mean, for example, we had 2 weeks rehearsal on The Favorite. I don't know if people have seen it yet, or 2 weeks rehearsal on this, and just couldn't be further from each other. I mean, as an experienced Josie, with her background in theatre, we were sitting around and doing table reads and talking to John Guy, the historian, and kind of diving into it in a more conventional way, at least that I was used to, having done theatre before. And then yours was just kind of crazy, and I don't know what we did there. Yeah.
Margot, how important was that rehearsal period? Because it almost is like, or it was made almost like 2 movies, right? Your last day on the set was Saoirse Ronan's first day on the set, and it was the meeting that's been imagined between the 2 characters. But in that rehearsal period, was that a time for you to get to know people you actually wouldn't be sharing a whole lot of screen time with?
Yeah, no, the rehearsal period was a real luxury and one that you're not often afforded in films. I'm not sure why, but it's a crazy thing. And I remember halfway through the rehearsal period saying to Josie, like, we haven't even started shooting and this has already been such an amazing experience. I just love that you're doing rehearsals. She was like, doesn't everyone when they make a film? And I'm like, no, they don't. I don't know why, but no, that doesn't normally happen. So I loved that, that there were elements of her theatre, background that seeped its way into this film, and that was really special and really cool. And I can't remember what you asked me now, but I loved the rehearsal period.
Well, maybe since we're not really spoiling it, I mean, according to historians, it never happened, but I think
the meeting, yes,
the meeting
of course.
Scene.
Yeah. Historically speaking, they never met, though they converse via letters that you see in the film, and we kind of replicate those letters almost word for word a lot of the times. So they had a very intimate relationship, but they were kept apart by the general council around them. So the meeting of Elizabeth and Mary is something that people have wondered about and talked about and analysed over the years, and it's been depicted on stage a few times, but it hasn't been depicted in film, I don't think, before. But it was, I mean, that scene was kind of the reason I think Saoirse and I, were so excited about this. It's definitely the reason, one of the big reasons I signed on for the project. I wanted to work with Saoirse, and though we only had one scene where we got to work together, it made the entire experience worth it for me. It was really cool.
And then actually after working together, you guys got a chance to know each other a lot better, because during last year's awards season, where you were in I, Tonya and she was in Lady Bird, you were together pretty much every week.
Yeah, we saw each other. So we did the movie, and then we went off, and then we both got nominated, and then we saw each other more during award season than we ever did during filming, which was ironic. But it was great, because you'd always go to something and be like, where is she, oh, there she is, and we'd like run to each other. It was really nice. It was nice to have a friend.
I want to ask you about the work of Jenny Shirkor, who's the makeup designer here, who 20 years ago won an Oscar for Elizabeth. So she's kind of the go-to makeup person for that character, and in a lot of other work she's done, obviously. Yeah. But there is an aspect of Elizabeth. It's almost like she's almost like a science fiction. Of course, she was real, but the the exaggerated brow and the red hair. What was it like? Because I mean, you went deep into this process. What was just that like for you as a performer?
It's nice to be in good hands. Jenny Sherkor is probably the most decorated hair and makeup designer working today. So I trust her. I've actually worked with her before as well, and she's just a legend. And I, whenever she'd suggest something, I was like, go for it. And Josie was always there. She was like, we're trying to figure out why did Elizabeth end up looking that way? The receding hairline, the fiery red wigs, the really heavy white makeup, drawn on features. It's great because she really did end up looking kind of inhuman by the end, which is kind of the idea. That she has really, in our story at least, severed all ties with her womanhood and with humanity kind of. By the end, she really is nothing more than the throne, as she says in that scene. So to try and understand why she ends up looking like that aesthetically, it tied in perfectly to our story and to the fact that she really did get smallpox, which in a lot of cases leaves people's faces and bodies permanently disfigured. So that worked perfectly. And then the next step was, how far do we go with it? In real life, Elizabeth also had wooden teeth. We didn't take it that far, but we did pretty much everything else. Yeah.
Jack, I've heard you say that you have lots of affection for characters with their finger poised over the self-destruct button, which I would say certainly applies here to this part. To what extent was that a really appealing aspect here that he's troubled?
Yeah, I mean, it's always appealing. It makes everything less boring to do when, if your character's sole ambition is to destroy themselves. It's I think it's a hell of a lot of fun to play. Obviously, not great when it happens in real life, but it's fun to play. And it's with Darnley, he really was. I mean, he was 21 when he died. He was, I think, 17 or 18 when he got married to Mary. And he was heavily involved in that 4 or 5 years where Mary was on the throne, and he was just a nuisance from the very beginning. And he was an addict. He was his sexuality was up and down all over the shop. Like he just wanted to consume. He didn't care. He seemed to just. Josie described it once as. Every single time he's in a scene in this film, he looks like he wants to put something in his mouth. And I think that's a wonderful description. And whatever it is, he wants it, and it's, but he was weird. I read something last night that he was described by Mary as the lustiest and best proportioned long man she'd ever seen. Long man.
Lustiest?
Aye. It was brilliant. But yeah, he was a complete joy to play, and it was particularly fun to just sort of push up against the sides as much as possible, and like what you could get away with. And a couple of things that I did, I was sort of quickly pulled back from. I think there was a scene where he's drunk at the wedding, and all the guys are dancing, and Rizzio comes over with the lute to try and distract him, and I think I grabbed it off Ismail and bit it and sunk my teeth in it. Like it's fantastic when you have that license when there's just like nothing's wrong really, and I thought we were wearing denim anyway, so like, you gotta go for it, yeah.
Joe, I would ask you about working with Margot because most people like us know that 2 years ago you were plucked out of, if I can say, obscurity by Ang Lee to star in Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. And I've heard on the set of that film, we're asking all of the supporting actors their advice on their career choices. So I'm wondering what it was like sharing almost all of your scenes, I think, with Margot, and what advice you sought from her, possibly.
It was amazing. I don't think I really asked I don't think there was any advice in that sense passed on, but just working with someone who's, so amazingly talented and experienced, and getting to watch them work and disappear into a role, which she so clearly does in this, vocally, physically, the costume, everything. It's just a real honor, especially to, at a relatively early stage of my career still, to be working with people like Margot was amazing. But I don't think asked for any advice. I should have. There's still time.
On the award circuit this year, you guys can meet up a lot more. So there's some questions here from people in the audience. Sarah Jensen, it's an interesting question about what work did you do to inform your understanding of the historical context. But I guess in addition to reading John Guy's book and talking to people, was something about the costumes or the locations that you were shooting in that helped to inform?
A lot of the time we were shooting at locations where our characters actually were where the real life people inhabited and spent time. So that was kind of a wild experience. A lot of the time we were walking down hallways knowing that our characters, the people we're playing, did the exact same thing in the exact same place. And then beyond that, I think everyone, I know you mentioned before Jenny did the previous Elizabeth films, but so did Alex Byrne, our costume designer. But she had, as Jack mentioned, everyone was wearing denim. I don't know if that was clear on screen, but it was just, they both had such confident choices to make, I think because they had explored the time period so thoroughly. And same thing, we could do all the research we want, I think, with John Guy's book and other pieces of research and history, and you can do all that, but at some point you kind of have to have, you have to make some brave choices, and they have to come from a kind of a human place. So I think for most of us, at least, at some point you do all the research and then you put it aside and you just think like a person, and how do people react in these situations. And we're playing young people. I mean, they were young, they were teenagers running empires, and if you think back to what mistakes you might have made when you're a teenager, there's obviously a lot more at stake for them, but you mess up, you screw up, you do something dumb, and you regret it later. So it's kind of fun. It's fun to explore the history, but it's also fun to kind of see the more human side of the characters.
Well, was it central in all of your minds that although the events that you're depicting are 400 or 500 years old, there's so much about the story that is so relevant and so fresh for right now? Curious to ask everybody about that, about reading the material and seeing the timeliness in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the UK at the moment as well, in particular with what's happening with Brexit and things like that. We're not shy of a political mess in the UK at all. And there's a great history in that country of inward looking as well, and the England in particular was, I think, one of the main reasons it was such a successful nation was that it was very good at looking in on itself, which is, it's not a great thing, that it's very introspective and very isolationist, and which obviously has its benefits, but has its massive downsides as well. And Scotland as a nation in that time was unbelievably poor in comparison, but the Stuart kings, of which Mary was one, Stuart Queen, obviously. They were like the most ostentatious, and they would throw massive balls. But the reason that they could do that and cover themselves in loads of gold is because they were never at war. Scotland, England was. England, loved a fight, whereas the Scots were never really involved, and so they could spend so much. The Stuart kings were always done up like right dandies. And Mary was no exception, because as well she was brought up in the French court, and so was used to sort of utter glam, and turned up in Scotland and did exactly that, and probably was one of the main contributors to the fact that she was kicked out, really. Yeah.
I think it's also relevant in terms socially as what's going on today, and it's not the only film this year to do this, but it's refreshing to see a film with two strong female leads, which is a nice difference, and an important one, and I think also within the story, one thing that I picked up on is just how, which is relevant today and is always relevant, but you can forget, is really how the whims of a few people can alter the fate of a nation, a handful of people in a room, which is something we're seeing every day in the news.
Another question from someone asks, what is always the first step in your character development process? Is there a certain thing? I mean, I remember interviewing someone who said that once the shoes fit, it might be a little sort of eccentric, but then everything else made sense. Is there something like that for you three?
My process, I mean, I guess everyone kind of alters their process depending on the character and the kind of project you're doing. I generally start, I spend a lot of time with my acting coach. I do a lot of movement work with a movement coach as well, animal work and Alexander technique, and obviously a lot of dialect work because I'm never doing an Australian character, so that doesn't come up often. So I generally start there and then research the history, the time period, all that kind of stuff, and then once I've done all that prep work on my own, then I spend time with the director and find out how to use all that for to accommodate their vision. So I don't know at what point I feel like I'm ready. I feel like sometimes I do a job and I'm 3 weeks in and I'm like, I don't know this character. I don't know who this character is, and I've done months and months of prep and I've done hours and hours and I still don't know who they are. And then other times the character kind of like, I don't know, I get them pretty quickly. And then likewise, sometimes they leave me very quickly and sometimes they hang around for a long time. So it changes all the time, but they're generally the steps I take. And then Josie, like you said, we had a great amount of rehearsal period, and she enlisted the help of Wayne McGregor, who's a brilliant choreographer and worked a lot with us on our movement. And to prepare us for how we should move in a court and etiquette and all that kind of stuff, and how to convey power throughout without saying anything. Things like that was really interesting. But for me, the moment where I knew I had the character, I'm not sure. Probably the first time I was all done up in the look.
Yeah. Do you guys have any first steps?
Not really. It's a hard thing to talk about because it's so intangible. There were things obviously studying the script and speaking to the director and doing your research and sometimes things just click a lot easier than other characters, and you're just like, oh yeah, I get this. I don't need to think about this too much. And other times you do need to search more. And then, like Margot said, it's also the conversation with the director. Like with Josie, we were very much encouraged to go down the road of research and doing table reads and discussing the characters and motives and intentions. And just to bring it back to a comparison to something like The Favourite, Yorgos actively discouraged or just didn't want to encourage that at all. And so there was a lot more, not animal work, but that kind of thing, a lot of rolling around on the floor, and we all switched parts and we read it like a play. And so you do what works for you, and then you try and sync it in with what the director wants and the tone of the film. And I guess it's a kind of dance between the two.
And Jack, maybe I can ask you, since we haven't really talked much about her yet, but Saoirse Ronan, who's absent from here, but of course is phenomenal in the film. Maybe was there anything in order to find the chemistry with her, which is very complex kind of chemistry, because they sort of hate each other and love each other. Was there some secret ingredient magic for that?
Maybe I don't know, but well, I mean, she's Irish and I'm Scottish, so there was a sort of instant understanding of heavy sarcasm. It's probably the best way. There was a particular moment, the scene in which she basically forces him to impregnate her, because his sole purpose, like for centuries before her, what women's sole purpose was just to provide an heir. And so, obviously, whenever there was a female monarch, the men were in that unique position where suddenly they were, all that was required of them was to produce an heir, and which is exactly what they did. They then produced James the Sixth and First, and he united the two countries. But the scene in which we did that, it was sort of written as if he forced himself on her just out of anger. And Saoirse and I actually talked the night before about it, that wouldn't it be more interesting if we really pushed forward with the idea that she really does force him into doing it, because I don't think you get to see that enough. You don't get to see women explore that enough, and so we really tried. I had a massive blood bruise on. She's right-handed. I couldn't, it was so sore. And we talked about it, and with Wayne McGregor as well, about how far it was more just Mary wanting a child rather than it being a sort of typical scene of she says something and then the man smacks her in the face and has his way with her. Like, she really forces him to do it because he's this sort of, A, gay, and B, just completely reluctant to be merely a pawn. And so a scene like that was... maybe with a different actress wouldn't have gone that way, but with Saoirse, whose idea it was to do that. It was extraordinary, and just little scenes like that just really helped the chemistry build into something that was sort of weird, which I think is exactly what the relationship was.
And we mentioned before the measure for measure that you just finished doing with Josie Rourke, your director, is also sort of pretty provocative in examining that aspect of sexual abuse going both directions. You want to just briefly talk about it?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, in the centre of Measure for Measure is a man who is the deputy of Vienna, and he enforces a law that says that there should be no sex before marriage. So he makes an example of a very prominent young man who's had sex before marriage, puts him in jail, sentences him to death. His sister, who is a nun and just about to commit herself to a nunnery, comes to beg for his life. And during the scene, the character that I play propositions her and says, well, if you sleep with me, then I'll let your brother go. And so we do that straight version. And then in the second half, myself and the actress who plays the nun, Hayley Atwell, switched it. So she was the person in power, and I was the person that was coming to beg for my brother's life. And so you got to see... it was incredible how people reacted to it. It made a lot of people very, very angry. It made a lot of people very, very sad. It made a hell of a lot of people laugh at certain points. And it was just extraordinary to see when a woman is the predator, put it that way, how ultimately she is still it's due to the patriarchy. It's not just saying that women do this bad stuff too. It was saying that ultimately why would she, because we switched it to the modern day, to 2018, so she's like a CEO, but it was extraordinary, the reaction, and just putting a man in that position, but then ultimately that it really was a comment on the patriarchy, and then how that's when you're dealing, like we're talking about, with power. Seems to still be, everybody comes back to one way of sort of exuding power, is in such an ugly fashion. Yeah.
There's a question here from somebody, Melinda. It's kind of jumping off that a little bit. Is for everybody, what Shakespeare character do you want to play, regardless of gender or age?
Oh, that's a good question. Hey, you guys go first.
I want to play the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. No, for sure. Oh, yeah. She's amazing. I would love to play the nurse. Yeah. Play him like Franck from what's that wedding film?
Father of the Bride. I love Franck.
I'd play him like that.
That's so good. I have no idea. I only started really reading Shakespeare when we did this film, because William Shakespeare was the hottest thing at the time, and Elizabeth really liked him. So I was like, oh cool, I'll kind of fangirl over Shakespeare a bit. It's bloody hard to read, I'll tell you that much. If you don't, grow up doing theatre, it's far. But so I don't know yet. I still got to finish all of my works of Shakespeare to decide. But I like Jack's answer.
Joe, do you want to throw one in?
Not quite old enough for Leah yet, but
that'd be good, though.
That'd be good. Makes sense.
Young
I don't know. I would love to play Hal. That'd be a fun role.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah. I don't know. I'd have to have a think about it.
It's a good question.
So, Margot, one other thing. We talked about sort of research and prep that you did and putting on the makeup and the clothes. But in that scene when Elizabeth and Mary meet, there are just tears streaming down your face, and they're dripping off your chin. I mean, even with the makeup on.
Wasn't it?
Well, how do you access that place as a performer? I mean, if you're willing to share, it's got to be
I have a couple of cry songs that I listen to. In this film, I did a soap for 3 years as well, so you have to be able to cry on cue repetitively, all the time. So it's kind of like a muscle you exercise, I think. I was so good at crying on cue when I was a teenager doing a soap, but sometimes it's a bit harder to get there. Sometimes I just think really dark stuff, like my family dying in awful ways and stuff, which is a bit depressing. But when it came to this scene, I didn't need to listen to my cry songs, and I didn't need to think horrible things, because I had never seen Saoirse as Mary before, and I had just done the entire, all the scenes I do in the film. Went on this whole journey as Elizabeth, and I can't tell you how emotional that was. It was not forced at all. Like, I didn't want to cry in the scene. I didn't mean to cry in the scene, and I was sobbing. And the second she pulled that sheet down, that was the first time I saw her, and they'd set up for our close-ups and the cameras were rolling, and that's the take, because you couldn't hold it in. It was really emotional. I just knew that it was too late. I knew that if we had met a few years earlier, then I could have helped her, but I know that she's asking me something that I'm going to say no to. So even before she had a chance to ask it, as soon as I saw her, I was like, you can see her, she's like been through battle, she's been through hell, she's had her child taken away from her, she's reaching out to a fellow sister saying, help me, and I know I'm going to be saying no to her. And that killed me. The second I saw her, I was sobbing hysterically. Yeah.
And her face when she first sees you too, I mean...
yeah, that hurts too, because you can tell that she's like, whoa, like, what happened? Lizzie ain't looking so good. And that's the funny thing, you're kind of like, I think in that scene I really did want to play that Elizabeth was super embarrassed by how she looked, and knowing that she knows that Mary's beautiful. Everyone talks about Mary's beauty and her youth and all these things that she doesn't have, and to see her kind of react also to that initial like shock is that also helps. Yeah.
And a really poignant scene when you're holding up her portrait with mirrors. I mean that again I think speaks so much to the moment we live in right now, as well as
the oil painting. Yes, the Renaissance version of a selfie that we send each other. Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you guys so much. These guys have to run over to another Q&A, so please stay seated as they leave. But
thank you guys.
Thank you, Joe,
Thank you.
Jack, and Margot.